Hey Joe, how's your English practice going?
Hey, Jess. It's going okay, but I feel like I've hit a plateau. I'm not really improving as much as I'd like to.
I totally get that. I went through the same thing. What have you been doing lately?
I've been sticking to my usual routine, watching TV shows, reading articles, and using apps like Duolingo. But I feel like my speaking isn't getting any better.
That's pretty common. I had the same problem when I was just using apps and watching stuff in English. But what really helped me break through was talking to native speakers regularly.
Really? How did you manage that? I feel like it's so hard to find native speakers to talk to, especially when I'm just starting out.
It can be challenging at first, but once you find the right resources, it becomes a lot easier. I started by joining online language exchange communities. There are tons of apps and websites where you can connect with native speakers who want to learn your language too.
That sounds interesting. But don't you find it intimidating? I mean, what if I make mistakes or don't understand what they're saying?
Making mistakes is part of the learning process. Native speakers usually understand that you're learning, and they're often really patient and encouraging. Plus, the more you practice, the more comfortable you'll get. And if you don't understand something, just ask them to explain or slow down. Most people are happy to help.
I suppose that makes sense. But what do you even talk about with them? Do you prepare topics ahead of time?
Sometimes, but not always. When I started, I'd have a few topics in mind just to avoid awkward silences. But most of the time, the conversation just flows naturally. You can talk about anything, your day, your interests, current events, or even ask them about their culture. It's a great way to learn new vocabulary and phrases that you might not find in textbooks.
That actually sounds really useful. I guess I'm just worried about running out of things to say or not knowing how to keep the conversation going.
That's normal in the beginning, but the more you practice, the easier it gets. You'll start to pick up on the natural flow of conversations, and before you know it, you'll be chatting away like it's nothing. Plus, you'll be surprised at how much you can learn about their culture, which makes the whole experience more enriching.
I'd love that. Do you have any specific apps or sites you recommend for finding native speakers?
Yeah, definitely. I've used Teletalk and Tandem a lot. They're great for language exchange because you can search for people who are native speakers of English and want to learn your language. It's a win-win because you both get to practice. You can also try Speaky or Conversation Exchange. Some of them even have voice or video chat options, which is awesome for speaking practice.
I've heard of Teletalk, but I've never tried it. I guess it's time to give it a shot. Do you usually do voice calls, or do you stick to texting?
I started with texting just to get comfortable, but I quickly moved to voice and video calls because they're so much more effective. Texting is good for learning new vocabulary and sentence structure, but speaking helps with pronunciation, intonation, and fluency. It's like you get the full package.
That makes sense. I think I'll start with texting too, just to build up some confidence, and then I'll move on to calls. How often do you chat with your language partners?
I try to talk to them a few times a week, but even if you can manage once or twice a week, it's really beneficial. The key is consistency. It's not about cramming all your practice into one session, but making it a regular part of your routine.
Thanks. So, when you first started talking to native speakers, did you find it hard to keep up with their speed? I always worry that they'll speak too fast for me to understand.
Oh, definitely. In the beginning, it was a bit overwhelming because they do tend to speak faster than what you're used to hearing in movies or on learning apps. But here's the thing, most native speakers will naturally slow down once they realize you're learning. And if they don't, just politely ask them to speak a bit slower. They usually don't mind at all.
That's good to know. I guess I need to remind myself that it's okay to ask for help. I tend to get shy when I don't understand something.
I totally get that, but honestly, asking for help or clarification is a big part of learning. It shows that you're engaged and trying to improve. Plus, it can lead to some really interesting conversations. Sometimes, they'll even teach you alternative ways to say something, which adds to your vocabulary.
That's true. I hadn't thought of it that way. Did you ever run into situations where you just couldn't think of the right word or phrase in English?
All the time. It's pretty common, especially when you're just starting out. What I usually do is try to describe what I'm thinking of in simpler words. Native speakers are pretty good at figuring out what you mean. Sometimes they'll even give you the word you're looking for, which is super helpful.
That's a smart strategy. I guess it's like a puzzle, using what you know to piece together the meaning. Do you ever mix up words from your native language with English when you're speaking?
Oh, yeah, especially when I'm tired or thinking too quickly. It's easy to slip into your native language, but I've found that over time, it happens less and less. The more you practice, the more natural English becomes. And even if you do mix languages, it's not a big deal. You can always correct yourself, and most native speakers will understand what happened.
I'm glad to hear that it gets easier. I've had moments where I accidentally switch languages mid-sentence, and it's pretty embarrassing.
It happens to everyone. The key is not to let it discourage you. Just laugh it off and keep going. The important thing is that you're communicating and learning. Every conversation is progress, even if it's not perfect.
That's true. I'll try to keep that in mind. So, what about accents? Did you find it hard to understand different accents? Or do you focus on learning one particular accent?
Accents can be tricky, especially if you're not used to hearing a variety of them. At first, I focused on understanding and mimicking the standard American or British accent because they're the most common in learning resources. But as I talked to more people, I started encountering different accents: Australian, Irish, Canadian, and so on. It was challenging at first, but now I see it as an opportunity to improve my listening skills. The more exposure you get, the better you become at picking up different accents.
That sounds like a good approach. I guess the key is to stay flexible and open-minded.
Exactly, and it can be fun too. Sometimes I try to mimic different accents just for practice, and it helps me become more adaptable. Plus, it's a good conversation starter with native speakers. They love it when you're curious about their accent or dialect.
That's a great idea. I've always been fascinated by how English sounds different around the world. I should try learning more about that. Do you have any tips on how to practice understanding different accents?
Listening to podcasts, watching videos, or even TV shows from different English-speaking countries is a great start. You can also find YouTube channels dedicated to teaching about different accents. Another thing I did was talk to people from various countries in language exchange apps. That way, I got real-time exposure to different accents, and don't be afraid to ask them to repeat something or explain a phrase you don't understand.
I'll definitely try that. It sounds like it would really help improve my listening skills, too. I've noticed that sometimes I can understand written English much better than spoken English.
That's pretty common. Spoken English can be more challenging because of the speed, intonation, and slang, but the more you immerse yourself in it, the easier it becomes. Practice makes perfect, right?
Absolutely. I'm starting to feel more confident about trying this out. You've given me so many good tips. I think I'll start with those apps you mentioned and see how it goes from there.
I'm glad to hear that. Just take it one step at a time and don't put too much pressure on yourself. Enjoy the process and remember that every conversation is a step closer to fluency.
Thanks, buddy. So, do you think it's better to focus on speaking fluently first, or should I be more concerned with getting my grammar right?
That's a good question. Honestly, I think it depends on what your goals are. If you want to be able to have casual conversations and build confidence, I'd say focus on fluency first. Once you're comfortable speaking, you can always go back and refine your grammar. But if you're preparing for something more formal, like an exam or a job interview, then balancing both fluency and grammar might be more important.
That makes sense. I do want to sound natural when I speak, but I also don't want to make too many mistakes. It's a bit of a balancing act, isn't it?
Definitely. The good news is that as you practice speaking more, your grammar will naturally improve over time. You'll start to recognize patterns and correct yourself without even thinking about it. Plus, when you talk to native speakers, they might correct you gently, which helps you learn in real time.
I hadn't thought of it like that. So, it's more about getting used to how the language is actually spoken, rather than worrying about being perfect from the start.
Exactly. Perfection can be paralyzing. It's better to be able to communicate effectively, even if it's not perfect. Over time, the accuracy will come, and honestly, even native speakers make grammar mistakes sometimes, so don't stress too much about it.
That's reassuring. I guess I've been too focused on getting everything right and forgot that it's okay to make mistakes.
We all do that at some point. It's natural to want to be correct, but language learning is all about progress, not perfection. And making mistakes is actually a good thing. It means you're pushing your boundaries and learning something new.
You're right. I need to be more patient with myself. How did you deal with feeling self-conscious when you first started speaking English with native speakers?
It wasn't easy. To be honest, I was pretty nervous at first, but I realized that most people aren't judging you. They appreciate the effort you're making to learn their language. And the more I practiced, the more my confidence grew. I also reminded myself that everyone has to start somewhere, and that helps me push through the nerves.
That's a good mindset. I guess it's all about building confidence through practice.
Exactly, and remember, confidence doesn't come overnight. It's built up little by little. With each conversation you have, the more you put yourself out there, the easier it gets. And eventually, you'll find that speaking English becomes second nature.
I hope so. I'm going to try to remind myself of that whenever I start feeling nervous. I really appreciate all your advice, Alex. It's helped me see things in a different light.
I'm glad I could help. I'm confident you'll do great. Just keep practicing and don't be afraid to make mistakes. They're all part of the learning process.
Thanks. I'll keep that in mind. Maybe next time we meet, I'll have some stories to share about my conversations with native speakers.
I'm looking forward to it. And hey, if you ever want to practice with me before talking to someone else, Just give me a shout. We can do a mock conversation or something.
That would be awesome. I'll definitely take you up on that. Thanks again, Joe. You're the best.
Anytime, my friend. I'm always here to help. Let's catch up soon and see how things are going.
For sure. Talk to you later.
Bye. Good luck with your practice. You're going to do great.